Hello, welcome to today's edition of the Academy. Today we're going to continue our walk through Chapter 10 of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And we're going to start with sentence 14 and go through 20. We're talking about the 6 calamities. Now if you want to stay in touch with these videos as I release them, go ahead and click the little bell icon below so you get notifications. If you haven't already, please share, like, and subscribe. And hopefully you'll find some benefit in this series to help you become a better tabletop general. Okay? So, in this particular section, Sun Tzu switches focus from the terrain and the troops and the enemy and focuses on the general himself. And I like these parts of Sun Tzu's book because he's done this a couple different times. And when he does this, personally, I learn a lot because it helps me refocus my attention more on the things I can control myself. So, let's dive right in and see what we can learn from Sun Tzu. Alright. So we're starting sentence 14. Now an army is exposed to 6 several calamities not arising from natural causes, but from faults for which the general is responsible. These are flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, and rout. Other conditions being equal, if one force is hurled against another 10 times its size, the result will be the flight of the former. When the common soldiers are too strong and their officers too weak, the result is insubordination. When the officers are too strong and the common soldiers too weak, the result is collapse. When the higher officers are angry and insubordinate, and on meeting the enemy, give battle on their own account from a feeling of resentment, before the commander-in-chief can tell whether or not he is in a position to fight, the result is ruin. When the general is weak, without authority, when his orders are not clear and distinct, when there are no fixed duties assigned to the officers and men, and the ranks are formed in a slovenly, haphazard manner, the result is utter disorganization. When a general, unable to estimate the enemy's strength, allows an inferior force to engage a larger one, or hurls a weak detachment against a powerful one, and neglects to place picked soldiers at the front rank, the result must be rout. These are the 6 ways of courting defeat, which must be carefully noted by the general who has attained a responsible post. Okay, there's a lot in there, and almost all of it applies directly to the tabletop. Let's start with sentence 15. And this is actually a pretty good place to start, because he says essentially if one force is hurled at another 10 times its size, the force is going to fall apart. Okay, the flight of the form of the smaller one. Now, remember in his time, a lot of this was about numbers. But think in terms of tabletop and modern warfare especially. Remember, size matters. But even though Sun Tzu's thinking is in terms of numbers, we can apply it a little more broadly. So here we have to actually consider not numbers alone, but combat capability, being committed to oppose an enemy. The best way to illustrate this is by watching a game where both sides have the same number of points, because most of the games have systems that use some sort of point system to balance it, but where one of those players has significantly fewer units. It's interesting because in those situations, the combat capability of the smaller force actually may, on a model-for-model basis, be superior, but they can't put out as much firepower with so few units or models as the opponent who has many, many more units. So you can actually see how your smaller force, even though it has a lot of strong weapons, if the opponent is throwing out a huge amount of dice, that's really what firepower equates to on the tabletop, you're going to get whittled down. It's not quite attrition, because attrition is a very protracted experience. But here, think of any situation where you're using veterans against inexperienced, or elites against regulars, where you've got a small number of those excellent units. They will often be overwhelmed simply because of the volumes of fire coming at them. Okay. Now, you can avoid that by creating balanced lists. Some forces, some army organizations in different games are designed to be more elite armies. So you're still going to end up with fewer models, maybe, but you have to make sure that there's a lot of redundancy in their capabilities so that they can handle and fill gaps that would be present if one unit dies. As far as they should have a couple different roles that they could play. That way, when it dies, the next unit, also having a couple different roles, should be similar, if not the same, can take up for it. Okay. So remember, this applies whether you're building your list, or actually engaging on the tabletop with a portion of your force or the entire force. You think about the combat capability you're able to bring to bear on the tabletop. We've talked about some aspects of that earlier. If you miscalculate that, you don't apply or have a large enough combat capability, you're going to end up basically in flight, is what he calls it, which means you're going to lose in the tabletop scenario. Now, 16 doesn't quite translate perfectly, but I think there is some places where we can apply this. And it's really in the second part of that sentence 16. When the officers are too strong and the common soldiers too weak, the result is collapse. So, if you want to think about it, I'm going to use Cao Kung as he had a comment in one of his reviews of Sun Tzu. He states here, the officers are energetic and want to press on, but the common soldiers are feeble and they suddenly collapse. So you're pushing your men too hard. Obviously on the tabletop that's not going to play in. But here's how we can consider this. When a player sends out his weaker units against, not necessarily stronger units, but against a position where the combat capability of the opponent is higher than the units he's sending in, what else can he expect but a negative result of that? So you're going to have that kind of collapse of the units that you sent in because they aren't up to the task that you've assigned them to. Okay. Now in sentence 17, we're talking about higher officers are angry and insubordinate, meeting the enemy. They just rush into battle before the commander-in-chief can actually evaluate things. So we can use a commentator to help us kind of decipher this a little bit. Wang Xi, I think is how you pronounce it, has a comment about this referring to a general who's angry without cause. So if you think about it, here we're dealing with, on a tabletop, we have to consider our own emotional equilibrium. If we find ourselves becoming upset, we are likely to kind of begin to strike out, often without proper calculations. Now, of course, this results in making some worse decisions than we normally would. One of the things you also want to guard against is holding a grudge against an opponent. This may be subconscious, okay? Maybe it's that guy, okay? Maybe it's someone you've lost to repeatedly in the past and you're just driven to beat him finally. Well, if you begin to let that emotion play out, you start to react more emotionally instead of actually relying on your abilities, your colder calculations to get you to the position where you're actually doing better choices, okay? So, now, the next sentence talks about the general being weak and without authority as orders are not clear and distinct, and when there's no fixed duties assigned to men, all these kind of things, it results in disorganization. Well, that particular sentence, what we can really hone in on is the idea of the orders not being clear and distinct. Now, there are some game systems where orders do play out, where certain units have to make a check in order to actually do something. Those systems have that kind of in place, but what the problem with that particular system here in this context is that you don't really have control over that. So it's not really the general's fault if the unit doesn't respond properly. So let's put it in a situation where you, the tabletop general, are in complete control of what your units do. Obviously, your orders are going to be very clear. Their models are not going to do something other than what you told them, right? What's going to happen here is if you think in terms of creating your own disorganization on the table, because what can happen is when you, for whatever reason, decide to start moving your army in such a way where you're not optimizing and supporting each other, the units, one to another, focusing a series of units on a single objective or a small set of objectives each turn, thereby producing a maximum effect, you're essentially sowing disorganization where your entire line, your entire army, is dealing with parts of the disparate parts of the enemy. There's really no cohesion in the attack, no cohesion in the movement necessarily. So carefully consider how you're going to move and commit your forces turn by turn by turn. That's how you can avoid this disorganization that comes about by kind of just scattershotting your units against the opponent. Okay? So sentence 19, I like it. It's got actually two separate segments that I'm going to cover. The first half really, is talking about the general who's unable to estimate the enemy's strength that allows an inferior force to attack its superior one. You know, we all find ourselves in that situation. Remember the earlier many chapters ago, Sun Tzu talked about the 5 methods of military practice, and one of them is estimation. Being able to gauge the capabilities of your opponent and the capabilities of your own units. If you can't do that, you are definitely at a disadvantage. Now, some of us can't do that because we don't know the enemy's army. We're new to the game, we're new to that army, we never played it before. We're new to that player, we don't understand kind of how he thinks, so we may not grasp all of the aspects of how he's working his army. So we're not going to be perfect at this, but if you're at least not good at it, then you're definitely at a disadvantage, because if you can't estimate properly, you can't calculate properly. If you can't calculate properly, you can't risk assess properly, and then you're going to end up throwing up weaker units against stronger ones. And that's just going to cause your army to fall apart. Now, there's a second aspect that applies to some games, and that's the case of neglecting to place picked soldiers in the front rank. Now, what they used to do honestly not used to do, what you do in a military environment is you take your best soldiers, the most motivated ones, the most competent, with the most spirit, and put them in the important positions. I don't mean rank. I mean in the front of the battle, in the front line, to put them up where they'll demoralize the enemy by their vigor and their morale, and they'll bolster the morale of the guys next to them, right? This applies in a lot of different ways. Now, some game systems actually still use morale in one way or another, and offer ways to improve morale of a given unit by adding something to it, whether it's a model or it's a rule, some ability that you got. If you forget to do that and increase the morale of the unit that's going to go in against an opponent, you're going to end up with a situation where, if you don't have these adjustments, these buffing adjustments for morale, you're more likely to suffer the effects of poor morale rolls, whether that's taking more damage or falling back and routing or completely getting wiped out. You need to remember to implement in the key locations some sort of morale buffing abilities. This is not always available to all armies, but if they're available, a good general will use them, and will use those in the thick of the fighting, where he's going to get the maximum benefit from it. Not necessarily in the back line where the unit's not really going to do much more than shoot at long range. He's going to do it right up front. That's where he should do it anyway, so that the unit stays together in formation or cohesion, and stays in the thick of the fight still, and doesn't collapse as quickly. Okay, so those are the two aspects of sentence 19 to play out. And sentence 20 is really a reminder to meditate on these things. Think carefully about these things, because all of these are entirely up to the general. The general is the one who is making these mistakes or having these faults, and as a result, he sees defeat on the battlefield. So I suggest if you haven't already, pick up a copy and see what you think. Just read through it, give yourself some thought, evaluate your own abilities along these 6 calamities, and see how are you as a tabletop general compared to what Sun Tzu is talking about here. Hopefully, you'll pick up some points that you say, oh, you know what, I need to work on that. And, oh, that's why I lost that last game. I didn't realize that happened, but now I understand. So, I'm hoping you're getting something out of this. So please share, like, subscribe, comment below, ask your questions, start a conversation, and we'll see you in the next edition of the Academy. Bye-bye.